BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, everybody, and welcome to this special presentation of the Zodiac Killer News Report. As most of you know, there's a segment that comes out every Monday on this channel that talks about the Zodiac Killer. But for the most recent Zodiac Mondays, I've done book discussions, and I also did an interview with Dale Julin, who's the author of Catching Zodiac. That came out just yesterday, and next week I'm planning on releasing the book discussion on Robert Graysmith's Zodiac from 1986, so I wanted to keep up with the Zodiac Killer news reports because there are a lot of things that happen, and they're just numerous pieces of information to evaluate. New videos come out on YouTube and such, and that's the first thing that I would like to discuss with you guys. There is a new Zodiac Killer channel out there called Shel Cavalli Was the Zodiac Killer. Yes, all written as one word. But Shel Cavalli was the Zodiac Killer, and it features interviews with Mike Rodelli, who is the largest proponent of that theory. Mike Rodelli is the author of In the Shadow of Mount Diablo, and his Zodiac Killer suspect was named Shel Cavalli. He was a Norwegian-American businessman, a millionaire, and one thing that Mike actually shared in one of the interviews is that Shel Cavalli died with a net worth of $100 million. A very successful businessman, and this is quite different than a lot of the other theories that people have proposing suspects who were more or less criminal degenerates, poor people just living in abject poverty, who came up with the Zodiac Killer persona as a way to steal money for drugs. And yes, you're already thinking about some suspects. There are numerous ones out there that fall into that category. But Mike Rodelli examines the case in a different way. Now, I noticed that there was a comment that was written in on the first episode, and to be clear, 2 episodes have been released, and it said that this guy, Mike Rodelli, is just somebody who's pushing a book. He's just trying to sell another Zodiac book, and I have to disagree because Mike Rodelli is somebody who has followed this case for 25 years, and he is very passionate about his suspect, Shel Cavalli, being the Zodiac Killer, and it goes so far beyond that, just not just some guy selling a book. He's also made observations about the forensic analyses in the case, particularly pertaining to the DNA, and I hope they do a very big presentation on that with this new channel, Shel Cavalli is the Zodiac Killer. And to be clear, it's not only Mike Rodelli presenting, he is being interviewed and it's interactive, and I'm going to follow along with all of these discussions. The episode should be coming out weekly, and you can check it out too. The Zodiac Killer was a serial killer that operated in California in 1968 and 69. Whatever happened before or after that is part of the mystery. And as previously stated, I do a segment about the Zodiac every Monday called Zodiac Monday, just that. And if you want to follow all of these true crime discussions, you can hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps out the channel. And I also will be releasing episodes on Wednesdays, the AMA, where I respond to your questions and comments. We go through the material together and we have a discussion. And the Anything Goes Friday segment, where any subject is fair game. And if you want to support all of these efforts, you can go over to BuyMeACoffee.com. BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNid88 allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. Now, the next thing I want to discuss with you guys relates to a comment that was written on Black Box Online Radio by Steve Hodell. Steve Hodell is the author of a couple of different book series, Black Dahlia Avenger, Most Evil, and now The Early Years. Black Dahlia Avenger has 4 volumes, and Steve Hodell believes that his father, George Hill Hodell, was the Zodiac Killer. Now, some of you are already rolling your eyes already and saying, oh my goodness, why are you talking about this again? Because I received a little bit of backlash on the most recent live stream for discussing this particular Zodiac Killer suspect. Well, it relates to the theory that is going to be discussed in Steve Hodell's The Early Years Volume 1. Yes, it's a 2-part series, and Steve Hodell wrote this out on Black Box Online Radio that he was exploring the possibility of his Zodiac suspect committing a murder in 1921, and I was just thinking, well, what on earth? How could a Zodiac crime possibly take place in 1921? Not 1968, not 1947, 1921. And somebody in the chat was even saying, well, I would like to know what crime took place in 1921 as well that could possibly be attributed to the Zodiac Killer. And the answer is, actually, I got to share this first. I was trying to get a copy of Steve Hodell's The Early Years Volume 1 on Amazon.com, but then I thought, right before I pressed the one-click ordering option, I was just thinking, you know what? That is the only question I have. That is the only thing I want to know. That is the only piece of information that I am looking for. What is this crime in 1921 that could possibly be connected to the Zodiac Killer? So I just got the free sample instead, and I don't regret my choice at all, just being very clear. So I pulled up the free sample from Kindle, And it turns out that it's actually the 1921 murder of Father Patrick Heslin in San Francisco. And he was a priest who was abducted and killed by blunt force trauma. And if you were to Google him, you will find a series of articles, and it's been widely covered, as most true crime cases have. One thing I've noticed is there are so many true crime sleuths out there, amateur, professional, people writing books, investigative journalists, that most of these true crime cases that I've explored on Black Box Online Radio really do have a wealth of information that we can go through and evaluate. And I particularly like the article from SF Gate, which should come to the top of the search list for most people, and it says that it's the most bizarre kidnapping that ever took place in San Francisco. And I'm just thinking, well, what on earth happened? So this guy, Father Patrick Heslin, was a priest who was abducted, kidnapped, and murdered. But then the twist is that somebody started sending in these messages saying that they wanted a ransom for the priest and have him returned. Ransom to the tune of $6,500. Now, the twist, again, is I think it would be highly unlikely that George Hill Hodell could have been involved with this murder because, number one, there was a conviction. A man named William Hightower was convicted, and he was sent to prison but given parole. He had 26 parole attempts, and they were all denied. And they actually believe that he abducted the priest, murdered him, and then started writing in these messages as a way to try and extract the ransom somehow, meaning that he committed the crime more or less for profit. And if you do a little bit of Googling, you will also find that it's not just that they pulled up some Joe Schmo, this William Hightower guy. There was a burial site where Father Heslin was placed, and he was actually buried in the sand, and they found the body rather easily because his arm was sticking out of the sand, and the same sand particles were found at the burial site that were also on a tent that was owned by William Hightower, the person who was convicted. Now, George Hodell would have been extremely young at this time. He was born in 1927, so we're talking about someone who's 13 or 14 years old. Now, that's possible. It's possible for somebody to commit a crime like that via blunt force trauma, but I do think that it's rather unlikely, especially that this other guy was convicted, and again, they have supporting pieces of evidence that would connect him to the crime. And in Steve Hodell's defense, it says this in the introduction to Black Dahlia Avenger, no, sorry, not Black Dahlia Avenger, The Early Years, Volume 1, that he is exploring the possibilities or the likelihood of George Hill Hodell's involvement in these crimes. And he said some similar things about his Most Evil series on the comment that he wrote out. And then the episode that he was watching was called Zodiac, George Hill Hodell Debunked. Back in 2021, I did the Debunking series when I was talking about certain Zodiac killer suspects that I thought were less likely to be involved with the case, or less likely to have actually been the Zodiac killer who committed the murders of David Faraday, Betty Lou Jensen, Darlene Ferrin, Cecilia Shepard, and Paul Stein. And now moving on to the next segment here on the show, I am in a Zodiac Killer group called the Zodiac Killer Library, and I would like to give a shout out to Roland Osei, who posted a possible solution to the Zodiac Killer's Z13 cipher. The Z13 is the third cipher that was mailed in by the Zodiac Killer. There are 4 confirmed ciphers: the Z408, the Z340, the Z13, and the Z32. They get their names because of the number of symbols that are used in these cryptograms, and with the Z13, it has never been officially solved. The only ciphers that have been conclusively solved are the Z408 and the Z340. Now, I'm just going to read the full text here, because there's the introductory statement that is shared in this letter. This is the Zodiac speaking. By the way, have you cracked the last cipher I sent you? My name is blank. And then there are these symbols. AEN, there's the Zodiac symbol, a circled 8, K, circled 8, M, circled 8, what appears to be some type of, either prong shape, maybe it's an Aries symbol, and then NA and M. And this is a very interesting solution to the cipher that has been proposed by Roland Osei, where it actually starts out by using each letter is the first letter in a word, almost like an acronym. Like, if you think of the word scuba, self-controlled underwater breathing apparatus. Oh, wait, no, or is it self-contained underwater breathing apparatus? I'm not a scuba diver, I'm not even too worried about that. But in an acronym, each word, each letter is the start of a new word. Like, somebody once created something called the Narrative Ecosystem Design, and my name is Ned, N-E-D, so that Narrative Ecosystem Design was called the NED Project, and the only reason I remember that is because it's also my name. But what Roland did was, he created this thing that says, all expecting name, killed people, many people killed, name all many. And this is a different type of method that I've never really seen before in an attempt to solve the Z13. But I almost think that the first line on top where it says relic of people is irrelevant information. I mean, he might be using a particular metric to obtain that solution, but I don't necessarily think that's necessary to fit into his possible solution here. All explain name, killing people, killed people, many people, killed, name, all, many. But do you think that this is an appropriate solution or not? And when I ask these types of questions, I really want people to think, what did the Zodiac killer try to do when he created these cryptograms? Do you think that this is what he had in mind? My immediate response is, well, I do like the initial method. I mean, all expecting name killed people, and then it starts to get a little bit bizarre. This is what I'm reminded of when I had a professor once who wrote out a message for me saying that my paper started tightly focused and then it unraveled. He means that more or less it went haywire. And I have to say the same thing about this solution because it starts out as something that is somewhat that is reasonable, but then by the time you get to the end of the cipher, people killed, name, all, many, it's not even using very strong words in the English language, or, I mean, strong grammatical structures. One thing about the Zodiac Killer's messages is, overwhelmingly, they were coherent. He may have misspelled words, but if you look at the text that he created, they're understandable. He's not just writing gibberish words or writing words that aren't necessarily connected in sentences the way that this would be here. People, killed, name, all, many. And you guys might also be noticing that killed is represented by the Zodiac symbol as well as by the Aries symbol. And we aren't necessarily sure that that's an Aries symbol. Countless people have provided their own explanations for this. Chad Burke, who is the author of Cracked, said that he thought that it was the Arabic letter Del. And also, I've interviewed Melissa Rose Tappa, who is the webmaster of ZodiacKillerBomb.com. She thought that it was an anchor, and the Zodiac Killer was giving a hint that he was in the Navy, and it says NAM, Naval Aviation Mechanic. Now, they might have some those are defendable ideas. It's an unsolved case. But overall, I think that it's a very good attempt from Roland Osei to solve the Z13, but I am not 100% convinced. Now, moving on to the next segment here, I was on the channel Next Halloween, and this is one that I've talked to you guys about in the past. Next Halloween is a channel that has done a reading of all of the Zodiac Killer letters, and I've shared that with you before, and I actually think it's pretty good. There's also a reading of the Zodiac Killer letters on the Zodiac Killer channel, which I invite you to check out. I collaborate with them all the time. And they also did a dramatic reading of a different letter on the channel Next Halloween, and I confess that this isn't immediately Zodiac related, but I just wanted to share this because it was a reading of a letter that was written by Albert Fish. And Albert Fish was a serial killer who had multiple nicknames: the Moon Maniac, the Werewolf of Wisteria, the Gray Man, and he was a cannibalistic serial killer who targeted males and females, and the letter that he actually wrote was to the mother of a girl named Grace Budd, and the murder of Grace Budd is perhaps Albert Fish's most famous crime, as terrible as it is. And when they were doing the reading, it's just, he's talking about the reasons why he wanted to kill this girl and eat her body, and absolutely disgusting and sickening, but it's part of the true crime world all the same. And again, I invite you to check out the channel Next Halloween, and I also have an episode about Albert Fish called The Salvation Sinner. It's a direct response to the documentary In Sin He Found Salvation, and I also have a couple of older black box recordings about Albert Fish. And I think that the Zodiac Killer's activities are so weak and benign compared to other serial killers out there. And when I say weak, I don't mean that the other serial killers are strong. No, not at all. What I mean is that the Zodiac Killer is not vicious and ferocious. He's making lots of threats. Like, I interviewed Dale Julin, who's the author of the book Catching Zodiac, and he even said that he was one of the kids threatened by the Zodiac Killer when the Zodiac said that he's going to target the kiddies coming off the bus as they come bouncing out. Well, Dale Julin actually was one of the people who had to be under protection when the school buses were driving around in the 1960s, and I don't mean him specifically. Lots of kids would have been under protection. They had lookouts, and they had the police surveying the area, patrolling the area, trying to make sure that the Zodiac didn't attack. The Zodiac made lots of threats, but he definitely wasn't someone who was a vicious torturer, not somebody like Dean Corll, the candy man who would tie people to this 7-foot board and torture them. Even John Wayne Gacy, another very sadistic serial killer. And then you have the people like Jeffrey Dahmer and Albert Fish who are the cannibals. So with the Zodiac, I think there are very specific reasons why the Zodiac killer chose to behave this way, because for him, it's about the game. It's not even about the murders. Yes, he wants revenge on society. Yes, he wants revenge on somebody who hurt him in some way. Almost all serial killers are like that. And the only reason why I think there might be an alternative would be a calculating motive, where somebody would be committing the crimes for a specific reason. And that could be ritualistic, the people who get involved with cults, who are doing some type of initiation in some ways. And that really begins to question the entire name serial killer. If it's some type of gang-related activity, that might be something different. Cults usually get pulled into the serial killer world. But for the Zodiac, I mostly think that he wanted to get his name in the paper. And as I said, I talked to Dale Julin about this, and Dale Julin is someone who believes that his suspect was Gary Francis Post, and he is a suspect that I've been very critical of in the past. However, when I had Dale Julin on the program, we had both agreed that, we're just going to do this as a nice interview, and also, one of the reasons why I have guests on is not to embarrass them or try and do anything rude to them. I want to look at what they are saying and try to make sure that everybody understands what their theory is. And I think a lot of clarity came out of the interview, where Dale Julin was talking about how he was contacted by a group called the Case Breakers, who said, "Hey, we think you've solved the Zodiac killer mystery. We agree with your suspect. We think that he was the Zodiac killer." And then the Case Breakers began investigating further, and they made their own observations about the case, talking about the scars on Gary Post's forehead, and also that they found a photo which they had believed to have been a silhouette of the Lake Berryessa costume. And they made this press release in 2021, and I did an episode where I was very critical of it. But when I was reading Dale Julin's book, as I told him in the interview, none of that stuff is in there. And he seemed to be very grateful that the Case Breakers were looking into his suspect and they were helping him and they were contributing to the publicity. However, I just have to look at the things at face value and realize that Dale Julin is somebody whom I've always said I thought that he was an honest person and he really understood what he was talking about, because ever since the first interview that I ever watched with him, I could see that he had a reason why he was doing what he was doing. He wasn't just some guy that looked at a shadow on a piece of wood and the lines on Gary Post's forehead and then tried to whip up some twisted press release. He had he had reasons why he was looking into the case. Now, a lot of you people were discussing this in the comment section and being very critical of him because his primary source was a homeless man named Chris Avery. And I believe it was Brenda who wrote this in, just saying that this guy, this homeless man, Chris Avery, just lured Dale Julin to a restaurant. He told him he knew who the Zodiac killer was, and he just used him to buy an expensive meal, a $78 meal, and so on. All of this is mentioned in the book Catching Zodiac in detail, by the way. And I definitely think about that from time to time. But Dale Julin began to investigate, and he came to his conclusions on his own, more or less. And you can watch my 2-part book discussion on Catching Zodiac if you'd like to hear more, as well as the interview that I did with Dale Julin that has just recently come out on the channel. When I was reading the book Catching Zodiac, of course they talk about something called the Z18 code. The Z18 code is the final line of the 408 cipher. On July 31st of 1969, the Zodiac killer mailed in a 3-part cipher to 3 different newspapers. There was a letter that was copied 3 times, and each letter contained a portion of the cipher. It was mailed to 3 different newspapers in the Bay Area, the San Francisco Chronicle, the San Francisco Examiner, and the Vallejo Times-Herald. And it was solved by Don Hardin and Betty Hardin. And the trick was to find out that, okay, this guy's so full of himself, maybe the first letter is I. So they found the letter I, and then they thought he's a killer, so he's going to talk about killing, and it turned out that it was actually very early on in the cipher when he was talking about killing. And then, because they had the letters K, I, L, and L, they were able to get the word like. And the first line, almost by chance, was, "I like killing people because it's so much fun," and they were able to solve the cipher. So, when the Zodiac was creating this, the final line of that cipher is the Z18 code, which more or less doesn't appear to be any type of intelligible language. And I've said this before. When I was listening to the video on next Halloween, and they do the dramatic reading of the Zodiac letters, that's when it gets really creepy, when they're just like reading through the text of the cipher, and then they just get to the Z18. E, B, E. I don't know why. It's the only time I thought that it was creepy. And the reason why I got back on the next Halloween channel was there's also a dramatic reading of it in Robert Graysmith's 1986 book Zodiac, which I'll be discussing next week in a future book discussion. But for this one here, when I was looking at that, I've just been noticing this observation time and time again. It's even discussed in the 1986 book Zodiac, although very briefly, and that is that what if the Zodiac just used this as filler? People have been talking about this until the end of time. Richard Grinnell of ZodiacCiphers.com, Michael Cole, author of the Zodiac Revisited trilogy, they just simply think that the Zodiac's Z18 code does not have a precise meaning. Now, why would somebody do that? And this is one of my genuine questions that I had when I first heard that people are saying there is no precise meaning in the Z18 code. And the thing that I was thinking was, now, if somebody's going to take the time to put all of these symbols on, well, was he doing it by mistake? Is he doing it for what reason? And I genuinely don't think that somebody such as the Zodiac Killer would make those types of mistakes when he's trying to create the ciphertext. And it's possible that he didn't. Well, how could this work out? Is it just going to be something like what Steve Hodell thinks, that the Z18 has no precise meaning and then it was just created as a distraction? Lots of people think that. But how? Why? How exactly would that work? It is used to fill space so people wouldn't exactly know the real number of symbols that are in the solution. Again, it's just something to be confusing. An additional layer of complexity to the cipher, because if they were able to count up all the symbols, maybe they'd have an easier time breaking it up into chunks or something like that. And that's something that's been shared in multiple books that I've been reading recently. So I'm curious to see how far that method goes, because a lot of people will dispute that. Absolutely, a lot of people will dispute that, because some people think that the Zodiac Killer's name is found in the Z18 code, that it has a meaning or a precise message, and they're like, the Zodiac Killer said, when you solve the cipher, you will have me. Well, that's the part of the 408 cipher that has not been solved yet. And what do you think? Can I just ask you guys that as a challenge question? Do you believe that there is a precise meaning to the Z18 code, or do you agree with the people who think that it is just something that's been put in there as a way to fill space so you wouldn't know the exact number of symbols? Now, I also did an interview recently with Sam Fisher, who's the author of the Zodiac Killer Identity, and Sam actually has several different pamphlets out on the Zodiac Killer. His suspect is named Joseph Paul Franklin. And as somebody once wrote in the comments section, by bringing these people on to Black Box Online Radio and having these types of interviews, almost everybody has something that they can contribute. And I interviewed Sam Fisher about his suspect, Joseph Paul Franklin, for the Anything Goes Friday segment. Joseph Paul Franklin was a real serial killer called the Racist Killer, and I also did a two-part interview with him about the Zodiac Killer, and those are in both of the playlists respectively, the True Crime playlist and the Zodiac Killer playlist. And with Sam's suspect, he said that his suspect had a variant of OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorder. And while I'm not convinced at all that Joseph Paul Franklin was the Zodiac Killer, obsessive-compulsive disorder, in a specific way, relating to numbers, like the 408 cipher is going to be mailed on July 31st, expecting that people would read it on August 1st, 8-1, and it has 408 characters, and the final line is the Z18. The final symbols that aren't solved, 18. The number 8 is used multiple times, 888. It's almost as if this could have been done. This could have been done, not even necessarily so people wouldn't know the exact number of symbols that are in the encoded message, but because the killer had a personal reason for that. And I mean, so something like OCD, obsessive-compulsive disorder. And these things have been discussed multiple times, but out of all of the things that I think Sam talked about, he is the first person who has brought that to my attention, and I think that that is a reasonable observation. A lot of people look into the Zodiac killer's mental health, and they've been receiving an enormous amount of backlash. Number one, people are just saying that if you don't truly know who the killer is, these types of amateur psychological profiles might not be the most effective. And I do understand where they're coming from, but I don't see any reason to stop or hesitate because of, well, just because we are trying to make some types of educated guesses. In fact, I think people should keep trying to do that because somebody, just some way, somehow, might actually hit the nail on the head and figure it out. Now, you can also weigh in on that as like, what do you think about that as a challenge question, that the Zodiac killer had some type of bizarre form of OCD specifically related to the numbers, and that's why a lot of the things in the Zodiac's creations work out the same way. Notice that there are also 3 8s that are used in the Z13 code. There are circled 8s, and some people believe that that is not even a real circled 8. It is the symbol of Taurus. And I had a very bizarre take on that because I was looking at the Black Box Zodiac watch, and as far as I know, these aren't sold anymore online, but I took a photo of it once, and I've looked at this thing so many times, and I noticed that you have the Z13 cipher, right? AEN, Zodiac symbol, and then the 3 8s, and so on. And at the bottom of it, I noticed that, hey, wow, this photo of the Black Box watch even has a circled 8. And then I began to think, no, wait a second, that's in the wrong place. A circled 8 should be at, the 40-minute mark, not the 30-minute mark. And that appears to be the calendar that is used on the watch, like the 8th day of the month and so on. And I mean, I was really surprised about that. I mean, I haven't owned a watch like that just had the number there that's supposed to be the calendar date. Now that could be a pure coincidence, or this could mean that the 8th day of some type of month, like when was the Z13 mill? That was in April, so maybe April 8th has some type of meaning, or that the 8th day has some type of meaning. But that could just as easily be a coincidence. Not all Zodiac watches have the circle shape, and it just happened to be something that I caught by chance. But I do think that it's that the Black Box watch has that number on that with the circle around it. And as I said, I was even trying to find some other images of the Zodiac Black Box watches on their website for the Zodiac watch company, and I wasn't able to find them, so maybe this one is currently out of stock. But some other possible issues with the Zodiac's mental health that have been explored relate to perhaps mild dyslexia. The Zodiac misspelled words. And Soren Korsgaard is the first person whom I've heard talk about this, that the Zodiac may have done that because he had mild dyslexia, like mixing the letters B and P, and that's why there's some of the letters have elongated lines, and then they kind of morph into another letter. And someone who has taken that theory and expanded upon it is Adam Ivester, who runs the YouTube channel Let's Go Sleuthing, used to be called Real Zodiac Killer Revealed, and he is very passionate about that and very adamant about that. But there are numerous possibilities that have been put forward as to why the Zodiac had the odd writing style and why he had the odd misspellings. For example, the elongated lines were mentioned very clearly in a video that was made by Evan from Texas, and I wish that Evan from Texas had continued his video series. He made them about the Lake Herman Road murders and the Blue Rock Springs shooting, but he didn't continue with the Lake Berryessa stabbing and the Stein murder. But he simply proposed that his suspect, Hal Snook, regularly made elongated lines when he was writing out letters and so on. Mild dyslexia is not the only reason, and also numerical OCD is not the only reason why the Zodiac would have this fascination with even numbers, this fascination with the number 8 even. And to be clear, that really pertained to August 1st, 408 cipher 18 code. That's what Sam Fisher was talking about, and I just simply brought up another example of the Zodiac trying to highlight the number 8 on the Z13 cipher. So, as far as any of this stuff that has been mentioned in the episode goes, I want to get your feedback. And let's start from the beginning. You can weigh in on Shel Cavalli as a Zodiac suspect, and I would like to invite everyone once again to check out the new channel. What do you think about Steve Hodell's books? Any additional comments about him? Black Dahlia Avenger now has 4 volumes. There are 4 volumes in Steve Hodell's Black Dahlia Avenger series. Most Evil has 2 volumes. The Early Years has 2 volumes as well. And then, what do you think about the murder of Patrick Heslin. What do you think about the possible solution to the Z13 code and the Z18 code? I really should say the Z13 cipher. And I'm going to leave you guys with one final concluding message, and that is that I've been talking to you about some Zodiac Killer books recently, but one of them was brought to my attention from Batman66. Thank you so much for always checking out the show, Batman66. And he made a recommendation once for the book Titwillow, which is written by Judith Chapman. And her Zodiac Killer suspect is named Peter Plant. He was her late husband. And I have just picked up a copy of that, and I'm hoping to work that one into some of these other Zodiac Killer news reports, because I might not do an exact book discussion on it, on Peter Plant as a Zodiac suspect and Titwillow as a standalone episode, but I do want to talk about them in these types of episodes. And my simple answer is that one piqued my curiosity, and outside of just pulling up the free sample from Kindle, I knew nothing else about this guy, Peter Plant, and I wanted to hear what she had to say, and that's one of the reasons why I run this channel, so I can explore different true crime theories, listen to different true crime writers, and interact with them, and also interact with you guys in the comments section. So please leave some things down below. Anybody can write the show at BlackBoxOnlineRadio at AOL.com. You can also get me on Facebook. My personal Facebook is in the description box. And there is always BlackBoxNed88 on Instagram. And I release shorts and reels on Instagram and YouTube and Facebook, so you can always check those out, and they've been coming out a little bit more regularly than they used to. And there's always BlackBoxNed88 on BuyMeACoffee.com. BuyMeACoffee.com/BlackBoxNed88 allows you to make the donation or contribution to help the show one more time. And I'll see you over on Instagram. Goodbye.